It was a very politically sensitive time. You could feel almost an electricity in southern Africa of paranoia, of danger, of spies and counter-spies and smuggling and counter-smuggling. The atmosphere was very, very tense indeed. There were many factors that decided the end of apartheid, but I hope and I believe that we were one of those.
This is Radio Freedom, the voice of the African National Congress. Comrades and compatriots, duty call. The African National Congress commands and urges all of us to engage the enemy in united mass action.
You would need to be very unprincipled not to have taken some stand against the state as it was in the 80s, when it was particularly vicious, treacherous, and altogether murderous, that taking such a strong stand as gun running did seem like the right thing to be doing.
I was very much involved in South Africa in the underground operations. I was successful in exposing one of the major spies. I was successful in underground work, working right under the nose of the police without ever being caught. I first met Joe Slovan long before this project started in Regent's Park, open air, so that it was secure, we couldn't be heard. And we talked about methods of smuggling arms into South Africa, which didn't work. The casualty rates of all the schemes that had been done up to then were very high. We were losing a lot of people. Joe then came up with a better scheme when he introduced me to Rodney Wilkinson, who had designed the secret compartments in an overland safari truck.
The safari truck had several advantages. The decoy of the people on the truck seemed to be a great deterrent to anybody who wanted to search the truck, because they would be inconveniencing a lot of people, not just the driver of a truck carrying cargo. Also, border control searchers don't like looking through people's private stuff. They hate digging through piles of dirty old socks.
We then got funding from the ANC. I used to go to the ANC office and collect it in a brown envelope, £50,000 at a time.
We ordered the truck from Bedford, brand new truck. The budget was £80,000.
It took 6 to 9 months to actually build it and get it ready for shipping to Nairobi.
The people on the truck would be facing each other across a narrow passage. The arms were to be situated in long, vertical and slightly slanting compartments about 4 inches wide. You had to pull rods out of the crack in the seat, undo some bolts and pull the base of the seat out and flap it up, then undo some self-tapping screws to get the steel sheets that covered the compartments off. And then you would see the boxes of weapons in there.
The compartments were designed to take limpet mines, AK-47s, pistols, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. Heavy stuff, heavy to carry.
The first thing we had to do was work out where the trip was going to go, who we were appealing to, do the research, and get some publicity together. So we went and looked at all the current tour companies and what they were doing and who they were appealing to, got a name for it, and then set up some graphic designers to develop a brochure and actually make it a very credible thing, and then do the marketing. Get an office, set up phone lines, just set up a whole company.
It was a wonderful feeling, a sense of achievement, even at that stage when we hadn't achieved anything. But I felt that I had done a bit. It felt very good. The project, the thing was on the road.
We now needed a driver, which was supplied through the London anti-apartheid movement.
I was young and idealistic, I suppose, and, you know, I felt like I wanted to do something to make a bit of an impact, you know, make a difference to someone else rather than having a very self-serving career, which is me, me, me. So I was 19 when I first landed in Nairobi.
I had virtually no experience of driving a vehicle of that size. I'd only just passed my driving test for a car. It seemed like a massive job. I was very, very apprehensive. I was not 100% au fait and familiar with the route and the itinerary. It was almost too much.
The trips, the safaris had to be sold, and that meant going off to these Aussie pubs in Earl's Court where the young backtrackers would go if they wanted to know about safaris, and do a slideshow and tell them all about what sort of things they might encounter on the trip, and photographs and what sort of visas they might need and what sort of vaccinations and so on. But I'd never done it myself, and so there was this great sort of, a bit like an act, I suppose, really, that I was going to say, yes, you know, and you'd be able to see this, and you need yellow fever, and you need what I didn't know I made up.
We had to screen out anybody that we thought was going to be trouble on any level. So either they were going to be a pain in the neck as, you know, moaning travellers, or they were going to get sick because they couldn't, or they were going to ask too many questions because they couldn't. You needed very self-sufficient people. We gradually realised that the absolute best people were young travellers who were doing a year out from New Zealand and Australia, and even some young South Africans. There were these 15 to 18 innocent young tourists sitting on a powder keg. And even though I convinced myself that because they were so innocent, if anything happened, they could talk themselves out of it because it would have been obvious that they would. That's the way I convinced myself that it wasn't, that they weren't going to get into. And of course, in the end, you say, well, the end justifies the means.
This vehicle's powered by a didgeridoo.
There were several tasks I had to perform. The first, through the early part of the trip, was to get to know all of the passengers because we suspected there would be South African agents on board. Just looking, not necessarily knowing, but looking for anything suspicious. I was told that the person would probably pose as a photographer, that they would be interested in things like knives and weapons and martial arts, probably quite a macho type, maybe even someone with a moustache.
We had many different special assignments. One of the biggest, or the most why the unit was formed, was to stop infiltration of so-called communism in those days, the MKs, into South Africa. We were stopping enemy infiltration of weapons, of personnel into the country through combating behind enemy lines. We had intelligence that the arms were coming in. We didn't quite know how. There were quite a few of the overlander trips that were infiltrated at the time. I know there was one chap, we always used to call him Magnum, because he looked like Magnum P.I., the series that was on TV at that time. You know, tall, big shoulders, well-built, had a moustache, and he was Australian. He'd come from an Australian unit, come over to South Africa just following the wars as they went around the world.
There was one guy on the trip that I was very, very suspicious of. My brief under those circumstances was to try and get as close to that person as I could. He revealed some things that, made me quite concerned, but I think my conclusions were, on balance, that I couldn't say for definite that he was a spy, but as far as I was concerned, everyone else was not.
I like adventure. I've always been like that since a little child. So I'm always outdoors.
I was hoping it wouldn't be too Kontiki tourish, like we were looking for something that was as rough as possible.
Truck safari with a group of people, roughing it, seeing the sights, seeing the animals. That was what I wanted to do.
You don't want to go in one of these luxury 4x4s. That defeats the object. That's not Africa. That is sort of doing a fancy ride around any place.
The bush life for me, it's the best life. You unwind, like in God's garden,
Wherever we were, there was 1 or 2 crates of beer, and as we went down, the beer changed. It was bottled Kenyan beer, Tanzanian beer. It was all different stuff, but we always had it. Stayed pretty cool as well, to be honest. Yeah, that was good fun.
Oh, we had a bird book, didn't we? And a book on wildlife.
Yeah.
And
got to know all the tourist bits.
Yeah. I mean, our trip, the trip was the same each time. So after we'd done it once, you knew more or less what to expect from each stage and what to say at each point. The passengers weren't that demanding as far as, pointing out the right things. So.
Lots of them were only interested in drinking, really.
Yeah, I mean, the hardest part, keeping the truck going and keeping the passengers satisfied, because the passengers were our cover, and we had to deliver as far as they're concerned. We had to be good tour guides and show them the wildlife they wanted to see, get them to all the spots that was on the itinerary, Mombasa Beach and the Ngorongoro Crater, see a lion here, see a hippo there.
I think the passengers who actually went with Africa Interland got such a much better deal than most of the other companies, because we were so worried about the business failing because it was the cover.
We'd drive through the day till the sun was just at the point where it was starting to go down and the light was beginning to fail. Then we'd look for a campsite, usually somewhere off the side of the road. The first thing to get set up would be the fire, so that was raging, ready to cook, and everyone would have their routine.
It was, sort of almost like a roster system. You cooked in pairs and you had to sort of say what you needed for the night and a couple of days in advance, because obviously, there was a few days between towns or stops.
Each one of us had a chance to show what we could do.
Except
and it
me.
was nice. Oh, yeah, well, we won't talk about
I can't cook to save my life.
Campfires every night. That was rather special, yes, because everybody would sort of share their views and ideas of the whole day and discuss what they enjoyed or whatever. Just share experiences. That was really great.
If it was me, how I would do my job, he's obviously, the first thing he would be going there to do is to see if there are any sympathisers, ANC sympathisers. Once he's narrowed that down, to find out how strong their commitment is to the whole thing. You've got a long time to become mates with the guy, buddy-buddy. get pissed with him. You know, have a beer. Everybody's tongue loosens up when you've had a couple to drink.
We didn't talk to many people, did we, about politics?
Couldn't talk about politics with the passengers because we had to pretend we were just, you know, truck drivers interested in having a nice time in Africa. And
it was quite isolating, wasn't it, in that way?
yeah.
There was only a 2-week window for the delivery of the weapons, and one of the main things that could stop that happening would be a major mechanical breakdown. If we had a major mechanical breakdown, I certainly didn't want it to be my fault because I hadn't looked after the truck properly.
We were driving through Malawi and the nut that holds the wheel off obviously came loose and it started coming off. And as it came off, it sheared all the thread off the axle, so we couldn't put it back on. So we sent the passengers off, hitching to Lake Malawi, where they would go and wait for us to fix the truck and pick them up later.
Stuart was the keen one. He would have us bouncing all over the place. He insisted on taking the truck down a mudslide to camp by the lake. Great, fine, perfect campsite. But then the rain started and we could not get out at all. It was a day creeping up this mudded, rutted hill. We had to take the wheels off, jack the truck up halfway up a hill, pack it underneath, move it on a bit, do the same, pack it, move it on a bit, do the same, and it was a full day.
That Bedford truck was a monster, a real monster. Don't think it had power steering.
The plan was to stop at Lusaka overnight, and we'd tell the passengers that the vehicle needed servicing. And they would come and fetch it. That's the internal unit in Lusaka. Would fetch it, load it, and bring it back in the morning as having been serviced.
I used to collect the truck and take it and go and load the stuff in it. Usually, like, you were given a week before we met the truck to start making the packets up. It seemed a lot of time, but sometimes it was, we just made it. It was mainly AKs with the ammunition, Makarov pistols with the ammunition, grenades, and limpet mines, and sometimes TNT. You watched out that you never left fingerprints anywhere on the stuff. It was always, when doing this, that it's done properly and that it's never going to be traced back to you. Whole aim was is that we leave the truck exactly how the passengers knew where their stuff was. There was no hint that the truck had left or anybody was fiddling at the back of the truck.
I would tend to camp fairly near the border so that I would cross the border early in the morning with a fairly clear head and a fresh start the day ahead. We cross borders all the time, but the South African border had a special significance because not only was that the country we were bringing the arms into, Had we been caught there, the consequences would have been very, very serious indeed. The South African police had a reputation for brutality, even murder.
He would be in big trouble if he was caught. I don't think he would ever get off with less than a life sentence. And in that life sentence, he'd more than likely be knocked off. Or, worst comes to worst, he wouldn't survive the interrogation. Die of a heart attack or something.
I'd had some training in what they would be looking, the border guards would be looking for: sweat on your top lip, signs of nervousness. When the vehicle was being searched, I wouldn't watch. I'd walk away. I certainly never used to shadow the border guards as they checked the vehicle, because why would I be shadowing them if there's nothing to worry about?
It was always quite good to concentrate on sorting the passengers out at the border, trying to forget about what we were doing and just getting the passengers to show their passports, their visas. There's always plenty to be getting on with while they were looking around the truck.
I was always afraid of the sniffer dogs because they were possibly the biggest threat of actual detection of the weapons. That depended partly on how well the packing was done. Well, sniffer dogs react to all sorts of things. Basically, anything with glycerin in, they will register as explosives. I've heard stories since of border guards blowing up whole consignments of cough mixture, just to be on the safe side.
We always got inspected by customs, whether they came to look at the truck or not, depending on what they felt like. Sometimes they just look in the lockers and have a quick look round, but this time he asked me, how do you open these lockers? And I opened them for him. These are outside ones. Then he went to the inside and he said, how do these seats come out? And I got very worried at this point.
That was very scary.
Because obviously everything was under the seats, and I said, I don't know, I didn't build the truck, they're fixed. He said, well, how'd you get under them? And I said, well, you can't because of the outside lockers, you go into the outside lockers. And he said, oh, well, I think if you take this metal bar out, the seats will lift up. And it was very strange. It was as if he knew that we had guns underneath. It was as if he knew that he was going to take this bar out and find them. So he said, can you take this bar out? So I sort of struggled with it a bit, pretending I didn't know what to do. Of course, I'd done it loads of times. So I took this bar out eventually and lifted the seats up, and he was looking inside, and he was knocking on the wood. The wood was covering the metal which covered the guns, so... And then this most bizarre incident happened, which we don't know how to explain, but a car came and crashed into the border post or the tree or something.
Just next to the truck?
Yeah. And after a bit of, 5 minutes of dealing with this accident, he came back and said, OK. So we put the seats back down, loaded the passengers up and drove off, and we didn't speak to each other for, 30 miles or something.
There was an element of excitement, of worry. The big risk wasn't that we would be discovered at the border crossing. The big risk was an accident and an explosion with all the equipment in it.
It never really worried me that we were deceiving the tourists. They were safe. The weapons were packed safely. There was no danger of explosion, even if we crashed. That's my understanding, and I believe that is true.
They were getting what they paid for, which was a good safari. They were never in any danger, as far as I could see. They were being used, but
if we had been caught,
20 people or
they'd have all
something.
got let off, because it was obvious they didn't know anything about it.
Yeah.
I'm sure that after questioning, they'd all have been released had we been found out. the end of the trip with all the tourists, they'd all get off and go their separate ways in Cape Town, and then the truck would go on to wherever the drop was to be. The first one I did was in Port Elizabeth, and subsequent ones were in Cape Town or Johannesburg. We hired a van and camped in a campsite.
Unloading the weapons and getting them into the van, that was the hardest bit. Trying to do it without anybody noticing, and the boxes were really heavy. I remember doing it once in a campsite and have that dog. The dog seemed to hear every noise in the night and would start barking.
And they were parked on a really big slope.
Yeah.
And at one point the door swung open.
That's right.
And we thought somebody had discovered us, but it was just
the door
opening. But yeah, it was quite tense.
When we did a delivery, we would use two vehicles. We would have the van which was loaded with the boxes full of weapons. We would use a second car to scout the route first to make sure it was clear of road checks. Because we were so exposed at that point, and that was perhaps the riskiest part, even riskier than the border in some senses for us, because there was no way of hiding those boxes once they were out of the truck. Once they were out, they were out.
We always met somebody to find out where the drop would be, and they'd give us a place on a map and a time and any code that we had to follow. There were certain set days when the people who were collecting the drop would know to look out for a particular van with a certain sign in it. It could be a sticker or something hanging from the rear view mirror or something like that.
I had been told by my commander that I was to be in charge of the entire internal side. He didn't care how anything else happened as long as that was secure. We would have a pre-arranged parking place for the van. We would have 2 sets of keys made. The drivers of the Bedford would slip usually under the left-hand door. They'd slip the second set of keys in a very interesting little magnetic box that Manny had found somewhere. They were very useful, those boxes. And they would bugger off completely, okay? We didn't allow, for everybody's security, the drivers to meet directly with the operatives here.
Get orders and messages so that I would know where to go to either collect or drop a vehicle and take the vehicle to the safe house where I was staying. Then me and my direct commander, we would unload all these boxes, usually about 16 boxes because they were too heavy to do by myself. I'd try bit by bit to undo the boxes, some of which were rusted. And then from there, I would store them in locked trunks, cupboards, even under the cupboards in the kitchen, that kind of thing. And then as I got requests through my direct commander, I would repackage them depending on what they needed. So sometimes it would go into a car, into a secret compartment behind the seat, the specific requests that they wanted. Sometimes I would have to rewrap them. I had these huge boxes under my bed. I had about 9 under my bed. And then I had the trunks full, and it really, I used to burn a lot of incense in those days. Even now, I don't like the smell of it because just to get rid of the smell of weapons. So I don't like the smell now. Makes me nervous.
When I was recruiting people, I looked for people who did not look like terrorists, did not behave like terrorists, were above or beneath suspicion. So Martha, I can remember some aspects of the training, and mainly the costume idea of the miniskirt and the wig. But, and so she was saying, oh no, I'm not going to wear, oh no. And the way she just changed personalities when she put that on and became this sultry sort of whore, just wonderful, wonderful. In the case of James, James had this remotely colonial flavour to him. Sort of socks and sandals type, almost, big shorts. And he didn't have a political bone in his body. And I thought, he's perfect. He's absolutely perfect.
It was all a bit too sudden. I mean, I would certainly not regard myself as a revolutionary of any sort. I would be rather more on the liberal edge, outraged. One of those sort of people who writes to the newspaper would be more my line of politics. And it was an enormous jump. It was like becoming someone else very suddenly and almost overnight. I had to set up a large arms cache in Cape Town and then receive and distribute weaponry to outlying areas in the Western Cape. We set up elaborate mechanisms to ensure that I could receive stuff and how I would store it, how often I would distribute it, which would basically be once a month or so. Consignments would come down from Joburg in combis, panel vans. They would be sent to large parking lots. Prior to this, I would get one of our coded messages coming through. This would tell me a time and a place and that I should be picking up this combi. And it would also just ratify what the markings would be that I would recognize. At that stage, I had 2 hired garages in Cape Town where I was storing stuff. Drive there and I'd offload as quickly as I could and sort of cover everything with old furniture, blankets, boxes, and so on. What I'd have to do is to identify places where I could safely bury these arms and that could be easily found. So I had to locate a very easily accessible place that was at least partially hidden so that someone could unearth what I'd buried under some veil of secrecy and load up and drive off. So I would go and identify as many of these as I could and then come back to my garage and load up these boxes and cover them with blankets. I would also take tents, bicycles, folding tables, folding braais, really any junk I could, and throw it on top. So it would be very hard to see there was anything there, and also hopefully someone would be very unwilling to look. There's one thing they love in Cape Town, and that's someone who walks, runs, cycles, anything outdoors, and it's just absolutely acceptable. So I thought it was a very good disguise. I would dig this hole I had measured out. And when I was sure there was no one coming, no cars, no people walking by, I would lunge at the boot and grab this box and haul it out as fast as I could. And sprint, which was almost impossible because the thing was so heavy, for the hole I had dug in the bushes. And that was the process. It felt like walking a tightrope. My legend was thin. The distance between getting caught and getting it done was, it was a thin veil, it felt almost like. I never spoke about these things to anybody, except perhaps to Muff. But otherwise it was completely closed off, locked in a box and hidden away. I didn't think I would come out of this. I mean, I was absolutely convinced that I would fairly shortly be either dead or in jail. So I think I had no sense of a kind of future or the possibility of a future.
James became our best ever operative. Thoroughly motivated and disciplined, and able to go for huge, long stretches of time without contact. And always, always delivered. Never spoke to anybody. I mean, he chose to stay on his own. He always had friends and lovers and so on, but he never let them get too close because of this particular job. I hope we haven't messed up his life entirely, and that he's still able to recover some of it.
There was this slogan that every youth is an MK member, a student by day, soldier by night, which was what many people adopted. You would see a young fellow carrying a bag going to school, but at night he knows what is happening in the township, that we all had a responsibility to protect the citizens. The MK was well organized secretly, and the state knew exactly that the MK was an organized force. It was a force to be reckoned with. We were very active in terms of engaging the enemy because we were left with no choice. As for the armament, it was a question of having contacts, knowing exactly whom to go to and what to do.
We certainly wanted people to rest, to take matters into their hands, and to be the ones who confront the regime, because that is the only way you can win in the end. It is not a group of guerrillas who infiltrate, who stay in holes and who get up and shoot at policemen who bring about change. It is the people themselves who bring about that change, because they feel they no longer want to live the way in which they have been living. That is what brings insurrection about. As Mao Zedong says, only a spark that sets the prairie afire. So it's a small thing really that gets the whole thing moved, and nobody could say with absolute certainty when this thing was going to come about. But all we had to do was become ready.
What speeded events was the collapse of the Soviet regime, and therefore the removal of the threat of a communist regime taking over in South Africa. And once that was removed, the Western world felt free to look at the collapse of apartheid sympathetically, and promoted that collapse by way of economic sanctions.
There's Mr. Mandela, Mr. Nelson Mandela, a free man taking his first steps into a new South Africa. And a salute from Mr. Mandela, his wife Winnie, greeting the people outside the fences.
1990 was a complete and total delight in a very personal way, because it meant the end. No more digging. I'm sure other people experienced it differently, but for me that was the biggest sort of thing. No more digging, no more danger, and that I'd actually made it. Unbelievably, I'd come through.
Wow, I was very much happy. I thought that everything was going to be okay in the country when Nelson Mandela was released. But immediately, when the process of negotiations started, one could tell that they were starting to head for the wrong direction.
We are going to look very hard and earnestly into the whole question of the armed struggle. Firstly, there will be no infiltration of men and arms into South Africa. And any related activity to military action will be suspended.
We did suspend armed activity against the government. We never know, no longer again attacked power stations and Sasols and so on, but there were still forces which were supported by the apartheid regime, by the security forces.
The Inkatha is one of the secret organizations that was owned by the state under the leadership of Dr. Mangosuthu Buthelezi. They took some members of Inkatha from Durban to come and destabilize in the townships. So we would engage them at every level because they were armed.
Well, the security forces were arming Inkatha and they were basically slaughtering people all over the place.
It was horrific, you know, what was going on there. And, you know, negotiations take a long time. Look at Northern Ireland, you know, it's just, they can go on, and I didn't, you know, we were being asked for weapons and I felt happy to supply them.
The military wing, the Mkhonto Wesizwe, took a decision independently of the ANC that that movement of arms should continue. And the truck was part of that. The whole project moved from London to Johannesburg, where by now we had 2 Dutch drivers, Menno and his girlfriend. We were able to do 2 weekly tours and could do it more frequently than if it was done from Nairobi. So sales were actually conducted in Johannesburg for South Africans to do a tour of Zimbabwe and Zambia. Exactly the same routine for loading and offloading continued.
It's really hard now for South Africans and even in the international community to remember what things were like here in the early 90s. There was a war going on and, you know, communities needed defending. Years later, people can think, oh, you know, handling weapons is bad. But people forget what it was like then. People were getting killed every day on the trains and massacres all over the country, and especially in KwaZulu-Natal.
People were divided because there were those who were pro-negotiations and there were those who were pro the armed struggle, and which really led to me to be quite disillusioned with the ANC.
The armed struggle should not have continued during that phase, and the movement of arms shouldn't, but there was always a possibility, I suppose, from the military point of view, that the talks would collapse, elections wouldn't happen, and what then? You know, the armed struggle would have to continue, at least for a little while.
In the late 60s, I believed that the change couldn't take more than 5 years because it was obviously so nonsensical or unfair and dangerous. But it took another 25 years at least before people started talking. And in that 25 years, it looked as if we were heading straight into a civil war. It was a low-intensity war all that time. And thank God it never hardened up. We actually achieved the settlement without the war.
The whites should regard themselves as extremely lucky indeed that the conflict was settled in this way through negotiations. But then also that black people also should count themselves lucky. Because who wants to inherit a ruined empire?
I was disappointed that there wasn't an armed insurrection. I was disappointed that compromises were made. You give up your youth. You get into a situation where you are seriously, every single minute of the day, Monday to Monday, putting your life at risk. You know, you don't give up your spare time for something you don't believe in. So, with that commitment of giving and dedicating every second of your time to something, and it starts to build from 1984, 1985, we're going to have this armed insurrection, we're arming the people, and you happen to be one of the people who knows that every 6 weeks there's a ton of weapons going in or whatever. It's enormously cheering, and it's very inspiring to know that that's happening, and you obviously want to see that process through.
With no intentions of being gun runners and political people, and you know, we didn't want to fight a war. We just wanted to help the struggle. And whatever they wanted to do, it was their decision, and we would respect that. Whatever's happened since is a different story.
We didn't at that time have a list of possible job opportunities in the underground that you could choose from. It was, you were simply chosen, and that's what you did.
The passengers had a good time, and they got a bloody good deal too, much cheaper than the others. We had a job to do, that was the way to do it, and we did it. Now I think perhaps we owe them an apology, yes. I'm not sure how they feel about it now, if they knew.
That is a surprise. That's why I say, would it alter my that I appreciated the trip? No, it's not.
Actually, I can't believe this. I really can't believe this.
Under the seats. Could have happened.
If I'd known that, and they were offering another trip, I probably would have gone along on the next trip. Wouldn't have. It really wouldn't have worried me at all. I probably would have even have joined in. Who knows?
This is great. This has totally turned around something that I've sort of believed for 11 years. I'm not often shocked, I really aren't, but oh.
I think it's, you know, it's probably one of the best things I did in hindsight. If that was, you know, a contributing factor to apartheid being overturned. I'm very glad. Very glad.
My biggest issue at the moment is, if anything had happened to us, what would have happened to my children?
You know, that you can't help. I mean, when they stop you now, lock you up, the children were big already.
Yes, but still.
You know,
I mean, who would sort out that mess?
We would have come out. We would have come out maybe through the German embassy would have helped us, so, you know.
African people lost more lives than anybody in the struggle, but they would have lost more lives because obviously that regime would have gone down fighting.
They're in charge now. They're not the enemy anymore, but they've taken over, and that made a lot of people leave the country, made a lot of us just switch off and never talk about it. What we have to do is just sort it out, get over it. It's gone, it's finished. Come out of the closet, fix it up, start again.
There were so many of our comrades who fell. They are the people who deserve the recognition, the people who paid the ultimate sacrifice, the people... I'm here to sit and talk about it. There's so many good people who aren't, and you know they're the heroes.